think moral panic is quite a kind of a well-known concept in sociology, right? So it has a long pedigree, many decades, but it has meant different things to different people using it. I kind of well, unsurprisingly, I kind of use it in the context of what I said earlier about the reaction against neoliberal globalization, right, which takes the form of various types of populisms, authoritarian populisms. And to me, I understand moral panic squarely in the context of the rise of a sort of populist anger against the elite, anger against an elite that is accused of being responsible for bringing in the impurities into an already threatened society, right? And that's really kind of at the heart of moral panics, right? There's a structure in moral panics which I kind of adopt loosely in the book, which is to say that to spot a moral panic, you look for some sort of moment of concern, right, where people start to see that something's not right in society, and they are collectively talking about it and worrying about it, right? Enough for them to start to be hostile to an identifiable group within that society that is then kind of described as the cause of these problems, right? So I mean, these are the scapegoats. These are the folk devils, right? They are folk devils because there's almost a mythical quality to them. They've always been part of society, but always under control.
Yeah.
I mean, they could be they could be criminals, muggers, um, unwed teenager, unwed mothers,
Yeah.
teen gangs, and so on. And of course, in this case, foreigners, right? Migrant workers, right? So as erased as they usually are in Singapore, nevertheless, in these moments, they suddenly acquire a high level of visibility, right? Something went wrong in society, right?
Yeah.
Who's to blame, right? Well, here they are, the migrant workers and the people who brought them in. So this is when the PAP government gets very
Yeah.
nervous, right? Because it's their policy that is seen to have brought them in. And then there's a certain kind of consensus that's generated. And this is where, all the various parts of society kind of align, right? You've got political leaders. It could be, it could be opposition politicians. It could also be PAP politicians who make use of some of these populist sentiments
Yeah.
to get their own sort of political capital, right? In alignment with what you might think of as moral entrepreneurs, religious leaders, or people who have an influence on how we are supposed to think in values terms. And then the media, of course, the great media, right? That narrativizes all of this and produces narratives which, well, I should say, sells narratives, right, for eyeballs to
Yeah.
earn advertising money and so on and so forth, right? So there's a kind of capitalist logic to all of this, right? And they all come together, and out of this is generated the image of the folk devil. And so this work that I did for that chapter that you mentioned looked at how stereotypes of the migrant worker were generated or constructed out of what was potentially a moral panic. So I actually looked at a whole bunch of articles coming up from the mainstream media around about 2011, I think, just sort of the months before the GE 2011,
Yeah.
right, when the PAP had the worst results ever. So I thought, if we expected to see a moral panic, that's probably a good time to see one, right?
Yeah.
And what was interesting in looking at all the stereotypes that emerged out of the data set was that there were two kinds. There were clearly two kinds, and they were happening at the same time. One were the negative stereotypes, right? We were seeing examples given that shaped in our minds an image of migrant workers as, as dangerous,
Yeah.
as criminals, right? Or as people of low integrity,
Yeah.
or people of low quality, right? Or people who were here to compete against us, to take our jobs away, right? or people who were coming from culturally inferior places, right? The strange practices that don't cohere with our way of life in Singapore. So there were those more negatively inclined images. But interestingly enough, I also saw a lot of positive imagery, right? There were stories that presented migrant workers in terms of the shared humanity, kind of common humanity that we have. We're humans, we're people at the end of the day. There were articles that kind of sympathetically help Singaporeans understand what hardships they go through, right? So this addresses, the typical thing that Singaporeans like to say is, yes, they may not be eating well or they may not be living well, but it's a lot better than where they
Yeah.
came from, right?
Yeah.
So, but without fully understanding the hardships at every step of the way, right? that they,
Yeah.
so so there were stories about the hardships. There were stories about victimhood also, how they were very vulnerable within the system more than we think, right? um, uh, Things that we take for granted, in that context, is incredibly painful and threatening to them. And there were also very nice stories, in fact, of how migrant workers broke through that stereotype, and actually did so much service well beyond the call of duty. There were stories about migrant workers who were writing stories, writing literature, and it just kind of messed with the minds of people who had this very small sort of view about the migrant worker. So I guess one might say that there wasn't a moral panic. There wasn't a clear moral panic because the images were, both positive and negative. But one might also say that this may also reflect the ambivalence that we talked about at the beginning. We like them, but we don't.
Mhm.
And it shows up in these contradictory views, right? And as long as those contradictions can be contained in normal times, okay, life goes on, right? But in abnormal times, like the outbreak of a virus, for example, we suddenly start to see very pronounced expressions of different parts of it, and it doesn't look so ambivalent anymore, right? We come out looking very xenophobic, or some of us, and then it was very polarized, right? You got the xenophobic group, and then you got the people who are out there, kind of doing all sorts of incredibly generous and kind work to help the migrant communities out there.